The sound of shattering porcelain silenced the entire dining room of the Obsidian, Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurant. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of socialites and tech moguls. In the center of the room, Dawson Brown, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of a small country, stood over a kneeling waitress, wiping a speck of sauce from his $5,000 bespoke suit. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. "Do they not teach basic physics at community college?" he sneered, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. "Gravity, sweetheart. It pulls things down, just like your career prospects." He dropped a wet napkin onto her head, like she was a piece of trash. He thought he had just crushed a clumsy nobody. He had no idea that the woman kneeling before him held the patent that his entire empire was currently illegally infringing upon. Louise's heart adjusted the collar of her stiff, black uniform and took a deep breath before stepping out of the kitchen. The air in the Obsidian always smelled the same: truffle oil, aged mahogany, and the metallic tang of old money. It was a scent she used to know intimately, not from the serving side, but from the tables by the window where the city lights looked like scattered diamonds. That was 3 years ago, before the lawsuit, before the bankruptcy, before her name was erased from the industry she had helped build. Now she was just staff, a ghost in a waistcoat. "Table 4 is yours, Hart," the floor manager Gavin snapped, shoving a digital tablet into her hands. Gavin was a man who confused shouting with leadership. "And try not to screw it up. We have a VIP, Dawson Brown. If he complains, you're out. I don't care if you have rent to pay." Louise froze. The name hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Dawson Brown. Of course, it had to be him. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. Dawson was the CEO of Brown Infrastructure, a sprawling conglomerate that was currently bidding on the Skyline Initiative, a massive government contract to redesign the city's flood defense systems. He was also the man who had called her research derivative in a public forum 5 years ago, effectively starting the domino effect that ruined her reputation as a structural engineer. "I can take table 9 instead," Louise said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Sarah can take 4. "Sarah is on break. You take 4, or you clock out for good," Gavin hissed, turning his back on her to yell at a busboy. Louise gripped the tablet until her knuckles turned white. She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and the new experimental treatment wasn't covered by insurance. She swallowed her pride, a flavor she was becoming increasingly accustomed to, and nodded to herself. She could do this. She just had to be invisible. She walked out onto the floor. Table 4 was the prime spot, located in a semi-private alcove with a panoramic view of the Hudson River. Dawson Brown was already there, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. He looked exactly the same as he did in the magazines: slicked back dark hair, a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and eyes that looked like they calculated the cost of everything they saw. He didn't look up when she approached. To men like Dawson, service staff were part of the furniture. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Obsidian," Louise said, utilizing the flat, emotionless service voice she had perfected. "Can I start you off with—" "Sparkling water," Dawson interrupted, still looking at his phone. "Chilled to 40 degrees. Not 42. 40. If there's ice in it, send it back. And bring the wine list. The real one, not the one you give to tourists." "Certainly, sir." Louise turned on her heel. She knew the wine cellar inventory better than the sommelier. She knew that the 1996 Chateau Lafite was currently peaking, and she knew exactly which temperature the vintage required. She returned moments later, placing the water glass down with surgical precision. Dawson finally looked up. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? when they had met years ago. She was presenting a thesis on the stage of a darkened auditorium at MIT. She had been wearing glasses, her hair in a messy bun, passionate and animated. Now she was sleeked back, uniformed, and silent. "I'm waiting for a guest," Dawson said, picking up the heavy leather-bound wine list. He didn't say thank you. "Arthur Wenlock. When he arrives, bring him here immediately. Do not make him wait at the host stand." Louise's internal alarm bells rang. Arthur Wenlock, the head of the City Planning Committee. This wasn't a social dinner. This was a closing meeting for the Skyline Initiative. "Understood, sir," Louise said. "And Waitress?" Dawson smirked, looking her up and down with open disdain. "Try to look a little less desperate. It ruins the ambiance." Louise bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. "I'll do my best, sir." 15 minutes later, Arthur Wenlock arrived. He was a stark contrast to Dawson, older, with a shock of white hair and a weary, kind face that had seen too many boardroom battles. He wore a suit that was expensive but rumpled, the sign of a man who actually worked rather than just owned things. Louise guided him to the table. "Mr. Wenlock," she said softly. "Right this way." "Thank you, my dear," Arthur said, offering a polite nod. He sat down opposite Dawson, who didn't stand up to greet him. "Arthur," Dawson said, extending a hand across the table without rising. "Glad you could make it. I took the liberty of ordering the appetizers. The caviar here is passable, though not what I'm used to in Zurich." "I'm sure it's fine, Dawson," Arthur said, settling in. He looked tired. "I'm not here for the food. We need to discuss the structural integrity reports for the Sector 7 floodgates." Louise hovered near the edge of the alcove, waiting for the signal to pour the water. She was supposed to be invisible, but her ears were tuned to a frequency only an engineer would catch. Sector 7. That was the marshland district. The soil composition there was mostly silt and clay. Standard concrete pilings wouldn't hold without deep foundation friction piles. "Relax, Arthur." Dawson waved a hand dismissively. "We've got the best guys on it. My team assures me that the standard composite mixture is more than sufficient. We're going to save the city 30% on raw materials." Louise's eyes narrowed. "Standard composite? In silt? It would crack within 5 years. The vibration from the nearby subway lines alone would cause micro-fractures." "I don't know," Arthur sighed, taking a sip of water. "The Independent Review Board is pushing back. They're citing a study by... what was her name? That brilliant girl from MIT who disappeared a few years back. The one who wrote the paper on hydrodynamic stress in urban environments." Louise's breath hitched. They were talking about her paper. Dawson laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You mean the Banks theory? Please, that was theoretical nonsense written by a hysterical academic who couldn't cut it in the real world. There's a reason she's not working for any major firm, Arthur. Her math was paranoid." Paranoid. That was the word he used to destroy her. He had labeled her safety protocols as financial paranoia, convincing investors that she was trying to bloat the budget. Louise stepped forward to refill the glasses. She needed to hear more. "Still," Arthur pressed, "if she was right, and we use the cheaper composite, we're looking at a catastrophic failure if a Category 4 storm hits." If, Dawson sneered. He looked up and saw Louise standing there with the pitcher. He suddenly snapped his fingers in her face. "Hey, you." "Space Cadet." Louise flinched, water sloshing slightly in the pitcher. "Yes, sir?" "We're talking business, big numbers. Probably confusing for you," Dawson said, winking at Arthur as if inviting him to share the joke. "Tell me, what's the most complex thing you've had to calculate today? Splitting a check 3 ways?" Arthur looked uncomfortable. Dawson, that's hardly necessary. No, I'm curious. Dawson leaned back, enjoying his power trip. Let's test her. See if there's a brain in there. He pointed to the menu. If the lobster thermidor is 85 $, and the tax is 8.875%, and I leave let's say, a 5% tip because the service is mediocre, what is the total? It was a trap. He wanted her to pull out a phone or stutter. Louise looked him dead in the eye. $97.24, sir, assuming you round up to the nearest penny. Dawson blinked. The smirk faltered for a microsecond. He hadn't expected an answer, let alone an instant one. Lucky guess, Dawson muttered, grabbing his wine glass. Go fetch the sommelier. I want the 82 Margot. And don't touch the bottle yourself. I don't want your fingerprints on the label. The 82 Margot is currently unavailable, sir, Louise said calmly. We have the 86, but I wouldn't recommend it with the spicy notes in the appetizers you ordered. It will clash. I would suggest the 2005 Cabernet from the Stag's Leap district. It has the tannin structure to stand up to the caviar without overpowering it. Silence. Arthur raised an eyebrow, impressed. Dawson, however, turned a shade of crimson. He hated being corrected, especially by the help. I didn't ask for your opinion, Dawson hissed. I asked for the Margot. If you don't have it, go down to the cellar and find it. Or are you too incompetent to look for a bottle? I will check again, sir, Louise said, bowing her head. As she turned to leave, Dawson stretched his leg out under the table. It was subtle, a petty move from a small man. Louise's foot caught his shoe. She stumbled forward. The pitcher of ice water in her hand tipped. She managed to twist her body so the water didn't hit Arthur, but a splash of ice-cold liquid landed squarely on Dawson's Italian leather loafers. The crash of the pitcher hitting the floor was the sound that started the hook. The restaurant went silent. Dawson jumped up, kicking his chair back. You clumsy idiot, he roared. He grabbed a cloth napkin and began furiously wiping his shoe. Do you have any idea how much these cost? That's more than you make in a year. Louise was on her knees, picking up the shards of glass. I'm so sorry, sir. I tripped. You didn't trip, Dawson lied smoothly, looking at Arthur. She was clumsy, probably drunk on the job. Look at her. Gavin, the manager, materialized out of thin air, sweating profusely. Mr. Brown, I am so sorry. Is everything all right? No, Gavin, it is not all right. Dawson pointed a manicured finger at Louise. This woman is a hazard. She's incompetent, she's rude, and she just ruined my shoes. I want her gone. Now. And I want this meal comped. Of course, Mr. Brown. Immediately. Gavin turned to Louise, his face red with fury. Hart, get to the kitchen. You're done. Don't even clock out. Just get your things and go. Louise stood up. Her knees were wet from the floor. She looked at Arthur Wenlock. He was looking at her with a strange expression. Not pity, but recognition. He was squinting slightly, trying to place her face. Wait a moment, Arthur said, his voice quiet but authoritative. Arthur, don't waste your breath, Dawson said, sitting back down and brushing off his suit. She's just a dumb waitress. We have important matters to discuss. He tapped the folder on the table. The blueprints for Sector 7. I want to show you how we're handling the load-bearing columns on the West Bank. Louise froze. She should leave. She should walk away, never look back, and find a job at a diner in Queens. But she looked at the blueprints Dawson had spread out on the table. They were upside down from her perspective, but she could read blueprints in her sleep. She saw the red lines marking the foundation depth. 15 meters. Her heart stopped. If they built those foundations at 15 meters in Sector 7, the first heavy rainstorm would liquefy the soil. The entire structure would slide into the river. It wasn't just bad engineering. It was a death sentence for anyone inside that building. She looked at Dawson. He was smiling, confident in his ignorance. He was going to kill people to save money on concrete. Something inside Louise snapped. The fear of being fired vanished, replaced by the cold, hard anger of an engineer looking at a flawed equation. She didn't leave. Instead, she took a step toward the table. "Gavin, take her away," Dawson barked. "No," Louise said. Her voice wasn't the service voice anymore. It was lower, authoritative, the voice she used to use in lecture halls. "Excuse me?" Dawson laughed, incredulous. Louise walked right up to the table, ignoring Gavin's outstretched hand. She pointed a finger at the blueprint. "You're going to kill them," she said plainly. Dawson stared at her. "What did you say?" "The piling depth," Louise said, tapping the paper. "It's marked at 15 meters. Sector 7 sits on a glacial till deposit. The bedrock is at 28 meters. If you stop at 15, you're anchoring into unstable silt. The moment the water table rises, which it does every March, the hydrostatic pressure will snap those columns like toothpicks." The silence at the table was heavier than the silence after the crash. Dawson looked at the blueprint, then at Louise, then laughed. "Listen to this. The Waitress is an architect now. Did you read that on a placemat, honey?" But Arthur Wenlock wasn't laughing. He was staring at Louise, his eyes wide. He looked down at the blueprints, then back at her. 28 meters? Arthur asked softly. 28.4, to be exact, Louise answered without hesitation. And you can't use the standard composite C40 concrete. The sulfates in the soil there are too high. It will cause chemical attack and expansion. You need sulfate-resistant cement, type Phi, or the building collapses in 3 years. Dawson slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! Security! Get this crazy woman out of here!" "Wait!" Arthur slammed his own hand down, harder. He stood up, ignoring Dawson. He looked at Louise, really looked at her. He saw past the uniform, past the pulled-back hair. "Type Phi cement," Arthur muttered. Then it clicked. The hydrodynamic stress paper, the Banks theory. He took a step closer to her. "You're not Louise Hart, are you?" Louise straightened her spine. She pulled the hair tie out of her hair, letting it fall loose. She took off the glasses she wore to obscure her face. "No," she said, her eyes locking onto Dawson's terrified face. "My name is Louise Banks. And Dawson, you're using my math wrong." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. "Louise Banks!" Arthur Wenlock repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. He looked at the woman standing before him. The waitress uniform suddenly seemed like a costume, a poor disguise for a mind that had once been the talk of every engineering firm on the East Coast. Dawson Brown, however, was not a man who surrendered territory easily. His shock was quickly replaced by a defensive, venomous aggression. "This is ridiculous," Dawson scoffed, forcing a laugh that sounded too brittle. "Arthur, you're not actually buying this, are you?" Louise Banks had a nervous breakdown 5 years ago. She was institutionalized. This woman is just a disgruntled servant who probably Googled a few buzzwords to impress you. She's a fraud. Louise didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. Dawson's greatest weapon had always been his ability to rewrite reality to suit his ego. "I wasn't institutionalized, Dawson," Louise said, her voice cutting through the room's murmur. "I was bankrupt, because you sued me for defamation when I pointed out the flaws in the bridge project in Boston. A suit you dropped the moment I ran out of money for legal fees. You didn't win. You just outspent me." Dawson stood up, towering over her, using his height to intimidate. "You are trespassing. You are fired. And if you don't leave this restaurant in 30 seconds, I will have you arrested for corporate espionage, You're looking at proprietary blueprints." Gavin, the manager, sensing the radioactive levels of tension, rushed forward. "Hart, whoever you are, get out. Now. Security." Two burly security guards in dark suits began to weave through the tables towards them. Louise looked at Arthur. This was her one chance. If she walked out now, she was just the crazy waitress. She needed to plant a seed that Dawson couldn't dig up. "Mr. Wenlock," Louise said, ignoring Dawson and speaking directly to the city planner. "The Brown proposal relies on a proprietary polymer blend for the pilings, correct?" "Brown Flex?" Arthur blinked, surprised she knew the trade name. "Yes, it's supposed to be revolutionary." "It's not revolutionary, it's recycled," Louise said rapidly, the words firing like bullets. "It's a derivative of a mixture used in desert construction. It works fine in dry heat. But in a saline high-moisture environment like the Hudson Estuary, the polymer chains will undergo hydrolysis. They will break down. The concrete won't crack immediately. It will turn to sponge. It will happen quietly, underground, for 2 years. And then, the first time a nor'easter hits and the storm surge puts lateral pressure on the walls, the levees will fail." "She's lying!" Dawson roared, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "Grab her!" One of the security guards grabbed Louise's arm. "Wait!" Arthur shouted, raising a hand. But Dawson was the billionaire, and in this city, money spoke louder than bureaucrats. "Get her out of my sight!" Dawson snarled. Louise shook the guard's hand off her arm. She straightened her waistcoat. "I'm leaving," she said, her dignity intact. She looked at Dawson one last time. "But you can't fight physics with a lawsuit, Dawson. Gravity always wins." She turned and walked out of the dining room. She didn't look back at the stunned diners. She didn't look back at Gavin, who was hyperventilating near the wine rack. She walked straight into the kitchen, untied her apron, and threw it into the laundry bin. She grabbed her coat and her worn-out bag from her locker. She walked out the back door into the cold, rainy alleyway of New York City. She was unemployed. She had $400 in her bank account. She had just humiliated one of the most powerful men in the city. But for the first time in 5 years, Louise didn't feel small. She felt awake. As she stepped onto the wet pavement, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down. It wasn't the police. It was Arthur Wenlock. "Get in," Arthur said, his face grim. Louise hesitated. "Mr. Wenlock, I don't want to cause you trouble. Brown owns half the city council." "Brown is a bully," Arthur said, unlocking the door. "And I don't like being played for a fool. If what you say about the hydrolysis is true, I'm about to sign a death warrant for Lower Manhattan. Get in. I want to hear the math." Louise got in. The interior of Arthur's car was quiet, a sanctuary from the chaos of the city. As the driver navigated the slick streets, Arthur opened a laptop and turned it toward Louise. "Dawson sent over the technical specs for the Brown Flex material this morning," Arthur said. "He claims it's been stress-tested by 3 independent labs." Louise scanned the document on the screen. Her eyes darted across the chemical formulas and the stress-strain curves. It took her less than a minute to spot the anomaly. "Here," she pointed to a graph on page 42. "Look at the curing temperature. They tested the samples at 25 degrees Celsius, room temperature. But the soil temperature at 28 meters deep in the Hudson in February is 4 degrees. "Did they test it at 4 degrees? Arthur scrolled down. "No. The data stops at 10 degrees. Because at 4 degrees, the crystallization process in that polymer slows down," Louise explained, her mind racing. "It never fully sets. It stays in a semi-plastic state. It's like building a skyscraper on chewing gum." Arthur's face paled. My God! Why would he take such a risk? The liability alone. "It's not about liability. It's about debt," Louise said. She had spent the last 5 years reading financial news, obsessively tracking Dawson's empire. Brown infrastructure is over-leveraged. He borrowed heavily to buy the robotics division in Tokyo last year. He needs the Skyline contract to pay the interest on his loans, but the contract is a fixed bid. If he uses the proper Type 5 cement and deep friction piles, the profit margin disappears. He needs the cheap material to make the numbers work. He's betting that the disaster won't happen until he's retired or sold the company. Arthur closed the laptop with a snap. "I need proof. Real proof. Not just theory. If I go to the mayor with just your word against Dawson Brown's team of PhDs, I'll be laughed out of office. Dawson has the labs in his pocket." "I can get proof," Louise said, her voice hardening. "But I need access. I need a sample of the actual mixture they're pouring at the pilot site in Brooklyn. Not the sample they send to the lab, the stuff coming out of the trucks." "The Brooklyn site is a fortress," Arthur warned. "High fences, biometric scanners. Brown is paranoid about industrial espionage." "I know," Louise said. A small, dangerous smile touched her lips. "But I helped design the security protocols for that site 4 years ago, when I was consulting for the firm that Brown eventually bought out. They never changed the perimeter sensors because it would have cost too much." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. He saw the fire in her eyes, the brilliance that had been beaten down by years of serving ungrateful patrons. "I can't authorize this," Arthur said carefully. "I am a city official. I cannot tell you to trespass on a private construction site." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a keycard. "However, if I were to accidentally drop my site inspector badge, and someone were to find it—" He let the badge slide onto the leather seat between them. Louise looked at the badge. It was an access pass for the Skyline Initiative pilot site. "If you get caught," Arthur said softly, "I never saw you. I don't know you. And you will go to jail." "I'm already in a prison, Arthur," Louise said, picking up the badge. "I've been in one for 5 years. It's time to break out." The Brooklyn Navy Yard was a graveyard of rusting iron and new gleaming steel. The Skyline Initiative pilot site was located on the waterfront, a massive pit where the first of the giant floodgates was being poured. It was 2:00 a.m. A cold drizzle washed over the city, turning the dirt roads into sludge. Louise was dressed in dark coveralls she had bought at a surplus store. She wore a hard hat she'd salvaged from a dumpster and a high-visibility vest. The key to infiltrating a construction site wasn't to hide in the shadows. It was to look like you belonged there. She approached the side gate. The electronic reader beeped red, then green as she swiped Arthur's badge. She held her breath. The gate clicked open. She was in. The site was awash in the harsh glare of floodlights, but the shadows between the machinery were deep. A skeleton crew was working the night shift, pouring the foundation for the secondary retention wall. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the concrete pumps filled the air. Louise moved with purpose, carrying a metal toolbox. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the few workers smoking near the trailer. She needed to get to the mixing hopper. She reached the line of cement trucks. The drums were spinning, churning the grey sludge that Dawson Brown claimed was the future of architecture. Louise ducked behind the rear tires of a massive mixer. She pulled a small, airtight canister from her toolbox. She needed a wet sample. She waited for the driver to climb out of the cab to check the invoice. As soon as his boots hit the mud, she scrambled up the side ladder of the truck. The metal was slippery. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached the inspection hatch. She cracked it open. The smell of wet concrete and chemical additives wafted out, acrid and sweet. She dipped the canister in, filling it with the grey slurry. "Hey!" The shout came from below. Louise froze. She capped the canister and shoved it into her pocket. She looked down. A foreman was standing there, shining a flashlight up at her. He wasn't a regular worker. He was wearing a suit jacket over his safety vest. It was Jared, Dawson's head of security, the man who did the dirty work. "Get down from there!" Jared yelled, reaching for his radio. "We got an intruder on truck 4. Louise didn't climb down. She looked at the distance to the next platform, a scaffolding set up about 5 feet away. She jumped. She landed hard on the metal grating of the scaffold, the impact jarring her teeth. She scrambled up the levels as Jared shouted orders below. Flashlights began to sweep the structure. "Cut her off at the gantry," Jared's voice echoed. Louise climbed higher. She was 20 feet up, then 30. She reached the walkway that connected the mixing plant to the administrative trailers. She ran. Heavy boots thudded on the metal stairs behind her. She was fast, but they were stronger. She reached the end of the walkway. It was a dead end. Below her was a 20-foot drop into a pile of sand. Behind her, Jared and 2 guards were closing in, batons drawn. "Nowhere to go, Banks," Jared sneered, stepping into the light. He recognized her. Of course he did. He had been the one to serve her the eviction notice 3 years ago. "Mr. Brown figured you'd try something stupid. He's going to enjoy watching you go down for this." Louise backed up against the railing. She could feel the canister heavy in her pocket. It was the evidence that could save the city, but only if she got it out. "Give me the sample, Louise," Jared said, holding out a hand. "Give it to me, and maybe we don't break your legs before the cops get here." Louise looked at the drop. Then she looked at the conveyor belt running below the walkway, carrying gravel out towards the river barge. "You know the problem with you guys," Louise shouted over the wind. "You only look at the static loads. You never account for the dynamic variables." "What?" Jared stepped forward. Louise didn't hesitate. She vaulted over the railing. She didn't aim for the sand. She aimed for the moving conveyor belt. She hit the rubber belt with a grunt, rolling to absorb the impact. The belt was moving fast, carrying her away from the structure, out toward the dark water of the East River. "Stop the belt!" Jared screamed. But it was too late. The belt carried her past the perimeter fence, dumping its load of gravel and Louise onto a waiting barge. Louise tumbled onto the pile of wet stones. She gasped for air, checking her pocket. The canister was still there. She scrambled off the gravel pile and dropped onto the deck of the barge. She jumped the gap between the barge and the dock, hitting the wooden pier and sprinting into the darkness of the Navy Yard. She was bruised, bleeding, and covered in concrete dust. But she had the sample. Now she just had to prove what was inside it before Dawson Brown found her. Louise didn't go home. She couldn't. She knew Jared and Dawson's security team would be watching her apartment, waiting for her to return so they could silence her before morning. Instead, she disappeared into the veins of the city she was trying to save, taking the subway north to Morningside Heights. She sat in the corner of the rattling train car, shivering violently in her wet clothes, clutching the canister of concrete slurry against her chest like a grenade. It was 4 a.m. when she reached the iron gates of Columbia University. She hadn't been here in 5 years, not since the lawsuit destroyed her career, but her fingers remembered the code. She pulled her old alumni keycard from the depths of her wallet. It was scratched and faded, a relic of a past life. She held it to the reader, holding her breath. Beep. The light turned green. Louise slipped inside the engineering department, navigating the silent hallways by memory until she reached the materials testing lab. The room smelled of ozone, dust, and potential. It was a sanctuary. For the next 4 hours, Louise didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She worked with a frantic, surgical precision. She poured the stolen sample of Dawson's revolutionary concrete into a mold and placed it into the rapid freeze chamber, setting the controls to mimic the exact conditions of a Hudson River winter: brutal, saline, and unforgiving. While the sample cured, she ran a chemical analysis on the spectrograph. She watched the lines peak and valley on the monitor, her eyes widening as the data confirmed her darkest calculations. The results printed out at 8:15 a.m. They were worse than she had imagined. The brown flex mixture didn't just weaken in the cold. The chemical binders shattered at a molecular level. At 4 degrees Celsius, the polymer chains didn't stretch. They crystallized. It was a brittle, glass-like structure that lost 80% of its tensile strength when exposed to saltwater sulfates. It wasn't a building material. It was a tomb. Louise washed her face in the deep industrial sink, scrubbing away the grime of the construction site. She stared at her reflection in the metal towel dispenser. Her hair was matted, her eyes rimmed with dark circles, and she was still wearing the dirty coveralls. She looked like a wreck. She looked like exactly what Dawson said she was: a crazy, desperate woman. She couldn't walk into City Hall looking like this. She grabbed the printouts and the frozen sample block, wrapping the concrete in a towel. On her way to the subway, she stopped at a thrift store that was just opening its doors. She bought a cheap, oversized blazer to throw over her coveralls. It didn't fit well, but it was armor. She had one stop to make. City Hall was a cacophony of camera shutters and polite applause. The rotunda was packed with the city's elite, developers, council members, and reporters jostling for the perfect angle. At the center of it all stood Dawson Brown. He looked impeccable in a navy pinstripe suit, every hair in place, radiating the golden aura of a man who believes he is untouchable. He stood at the podium, smiling benevolently at Mayor Donovan. "This is a historic day," Dawson announced, his voice smooth as silk, echoing off the marble walls. "Brown Infrastructure is proud to lead New York into a safer, drier future. Our technology is light years ahead of the competition. While others rely on outdated methods, we innovate. We dare to go where others won't." The crowd applauded politely. Standing off to the side, Arthur Wenlock looked pale. He kept checking his watch, his eyes scanning the back of the room, sweat beading on his forehead. He was the only one who wasn't clapping. "And now," Dawson said, pulling a gold fountain pen from his pocket, the diamond on the clip catching the light. "The signature that secures our coastline." He leaned over the leather-bound contract. The silence in the room was heavy with anticipation. The tip of the pen touched the paper. "Don't sign it!" The voice rang out from the back of the room, raw and desperate, shattering the ceremonial atmosphere like a stone through a window. The crowd turned as one. 2 security guards stepped forward to block the intruder, but the news cameras swiveled faster. Louise Banks marched down the center aisle. The cheap blazer flapped around her, revealing the dirty work boots and stained coveralls underneath. She looked manic, she looked exhausted, and she looked absolutely fierce. Dawson looked up, his smile dropping instantly into a sneer of recognition. "Security!" Dawson shouted, his voice cracking with sudden rage. "Get this woman out of here! She's a stalker!" The guards moved in, reaching for her arms. "I'm a structural engineer," Louise shouted, dodging a guard's grasping hand. She held up the block of concrete, wrapped in the towel. "And this is the innovation you're about to pay $10 billion for." Mayor Donovan looked up, confused, his pen hovering over the line. "Who is this?" "She's a disgruntled former waitress," Dawson yelled, stepping in front of the mayor, trying to physically block Louise from view. "She was fired for incompetence last night at the Obsidian. She's mentally unstable. Get her out!" "Let her speak!" Arthur Wenlock's voice cut through the chaos. He stepped forward from the shadows, his face grim but determined. Dawson spun around, his eyes blazing with betrayal. "You what?" "I said let her speak," Arthur repeated, finding his courage in the presence of Louise's audacity. "I invited her, Mr. Mayor." The guards hesitated. The mayor looked from Dawson to Arthur, sensing the shift in power. He lowered his pen. "Step forward," the mayor commanded. Louise reached the podium. She was trembling, but she forced her hands to be steady. She unwrapped the towel and placed the grey block of concrete on the polished mahogany table, right next to the contract. It looked solid. It looked normal. It looked innocent. "This is a sample of the brown flecks mixture, taken directly from the Brooklyn pilot site 6 hours ago," Louise said, her voice shaking slightly before stealing into the authoritative tone of a lecturer. "Dawson claims it can withstand the hydrostatic pressure of the Hudson River." "It can!" Dawson spat, sweat beginning to break on his forehead. "It's been tested by 3 labs." "At room temperature," Louise corrected, locking eyes with him. "But the river isn't room temperature, is it, Mr. Mayor? Not in February. Not when the storms hit." She reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a simple, standard-issue claw hammer. The room gasped. The security guards tensed, hands hovering over their holsters. But the mayor held up a hand. He was an engineer by trade before he was a politician. He was intrigued. "If this concrete is structural grade," Louise said, addressing the news cameras directly, "it should withstand 5,000 psi. A tap from this hammer should bounce right off. It should ring like a bell." "This is a circus," Dawson sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to the grey block. "You're going to damage the table, you lunatic." "Watch," Louise said softly. She didn't swing hard. She didn't need to. She simply raised the hammer 6 inches above the block she had frozen to 4 degrees Celsius, and let gravity do the work. Crack. The sound was shockingly loud, like a gunshot in a library. The block didn't just chip. It didn't just crack. It exploded. The concrete disintegrated instantly upon impact, shattering into a pile of grey dust and jagged, glass-like shards that skittered across the polished table. It had absolutely no structural integrity. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the whir of camera lenses zooming in. Louise put the hammer down. She reached out and picked up a handful of the grey dust. She let it sift through her fingers, raining down onto the $10 billion contract, burying Dawson's signature in debris. "That," Louise said, her voice quiet but amplified by the microphone, "is what happens to the floodgates the first time we get a freeze. The binders fail, the structure liquefies, and lower Manhattan goes underwater." Dawson stood frozen. His face was the color of ash. He looked at the dust, then at the cameras, which were broadcasting his failure live to the world. She tampered with it," Dawson stammered, pointing a shaking finger. "She spiked it with chemicals. That's not my product." "I ran the spectrographic analysis at Columbia University this morning," Louise said, slamming a sheaf of papers down on the podium. "Here is the chemical signature. It matches your patent exactly. It's not tampered with, Dawson. It's just cheap." Mayor Donovan picked up the report. He looked at the shattered concrete, then at the chemical analysis. Finally, he looked at Dawson Brown with eyes that were no longer friendly, but cold and calculating. "Mr. Brown," the mayor said, slowly capping his pen and sliding the contract away. "We need to have a talk, in private, and I suggest you call your lawyers." The fall of Dawson Brown was not instantaneous, but it was absolute. It was a collapse that obeyed the very laws of physics he had tried to cheat. Momentum, once gathered, is impossible to stop. The video of the waitress with the hammer didn't just go viral. It became a global phenomenon. Within 2 hours of Louise's interruption at City Hall, the clip had 10 million views. By evening, it was broadcasting on every major news network from London to Tokyo. The image of the desperate woman in the thrift store blazer, shattering the indestructible concrete block, became a symbol of truth, smashing through corporate lies. The immediate aftermath at City Hall was chaos. Mayor Donovan, realizing he had almost signed his career away, along with the city's safety, publicly rescinded the verbal agreement with Brown Infrastructure on the spot. He ordered an emergency audit of every city project Dawson Brown had touched in the last decade. By noon, the stock market reacted. Brown Infrastructure's stock plummeted by 40%, triggering a trading halt. But the financial bleeding was just the beginning. The SEC announced a formal investigation into fraud, safety violations, and insider trading later that afternoon. It was revealed that Dawson had sold off a significant portion of his personal stock just days before the signing ceremony, a move that suggested he knew the product was flawed and was planning to cash out before the inevitable disaster. Dawson tried to fight back, of course. He held a press conference the next morning, flanked by high-priced lawyers, claiming Louise was a saboteur and a corporate spy. He called her unhinged and bitter. But the public wasn't listening to his spin anymore. They were listening to the other engineers. Once Louise broke the dam, the flood waters came. 3 former structural engineers from Brown's firm came forward within the week. They provided emails, memos, and recorded meetings where Dawson had explicitly ordered them to ignore safety warnings to cut costs. One whistleblower revealed that the Brown Flex mixture had failed 5 separate stress tests, but the results had been deleted from the company servers. Dawson Brown didn't go to jail immediately. Justice in the courts is a slow-moving machine, but he lost something far more valuable to a man of his ego: his relevance. He was ousted as CEO by his own board of directors in a unanimous vote. His assets were frozen by the federal government pending the investigation. The penthouse, the private jets, the Hamptons estate. It was all seized. The arrogant billionaire who had treated people like disposable furniture was suddenly a pariah, toxic to everyone who had once kissed his ring. But for Louise Banks, the world had flipped on its axis. She spent the first few days hiding in her small apartment, overwhelmed by the media storm. But when she finally emerged, she found that she wasn't walking into a hostile world, but a waiting one. Arthur Wenlock didn't just apologize. He came to her door with a team of city officials. He offered her a position as the head of the new Independent Oversight Committee for the Skyline Initiative. It was a prestigious role, one that would guarantee her a comfortable salary and a position of power for the rest of her life. Louise sat in her small kitchen, looking at the contract Arthur had placed on her chipped table. It was safe. It was secure. She pushed it back. "I'm not an overseer, Arthur," she told him gently. "I don't want to spend my life checking other people's homework. I'm a builder." She had other offers, too. The phone didn't stop ringing. Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, Gensler, Foster Plus Partners, every major architecture and engineering firm in the world wanted the genius Waitress on their payroll. They offered her signing bonuses that made her head spin. They offered her corner offices and titles. But Louise didn't take those either. She realized that working for another giant firm would just be trading one master for another. She was done with being silenced. She was done with being hidden. She cashed out her small savings, took a business loan that the bank was now all too eager to give her, and rented a modest office space in Brooklyn, overlooking the very shipyard where she had almost lost her life. 6 months later, the winter had turned to spring, and the air in Manhattan was crisp and full of promise. The host stand at the Obsidian was busy, the hum of conversation and clinking glasses filling the room. The restaurant remained the most exclusive spot in the city, a playground for the elite. However, the atmosphere had shifted. The staff walked with their heads a little higher. Gavin, the tyrannical manager, had been fired shortly after the scandal broke. Corporate ownership decided that a manager who bullied a national hero was bad for the brand. A man walked up to the podium. He looked older than his years, his face lined with stress and exhaustion. He was wearing a suit that was expensive, but clearly a few seasons old, lacking the crisp, tailored perfection he used to demand. It was Dawson Brown. He wasn't the billionaire titan anymore. He was a defendant out on bail, his assets liquidated, his name mud. But old habits die hard, and he was trying desperately to cling to the remnants of his former life, seeking the comfort of the places where he used to be a king. "Table for one," Dawson mumbled, avoiding eye contact with the young hostess. "I don't have a reservation, but I'm sure you can squeeze me in near the window." The hostess looked down at the reservation book, then back up at him. She didn't recognize him at first, but then a flicker of recognition and distaste crossed her face. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice polite but firm. "We are fully booked for a private event tonight. The entire main dining room has been reserved." "Private event?" Dawson scowled, a flash of his old irritation surfacing. Who could possibly book the entire restaurant on a Friday night? "Do you know who I am?" "We know who you are, Mr. Brown," the hostess said coolly. "But the reservation stands. It's for the Banks and Associates engineering firm. They're celebrating." Dawson froze. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Banks and Associates. "Celebrating what?" he whispered, his throat dry. "They just won the government contract to redesign the Brooklyn seawall," the hostess said, beaming with genuine admiration. "They beat out 4 international firms. It's the biggest contract of the year." Just then, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open with a soft chime. A group of people walked out, laughter spilling into the lobby. It was a diverse group, young engineers, seasoned architects, men and women of every background. They looked energized, happy, and united. And in the center of them was Louise. She looked radiant. Gone was the ill-fitting waiter's uniform. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed power, elegance, and modern design. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves. She wasn't just a participant in the group, she was the gravitational center. Arthur Wenlock was there too, walking by her side, listening intently to something she was saying. Louise stopped mid-sentence when she saw Dawson standing by the coat check. The laughter from her group died down as they followed her gaze. The lobby went quiet, a heavy, loaded silence that mirrored that night 6 months ago. But the dynamic was entirely reversed. Dawson was the one on the outside, small and diminishing. Louise was the titan. Dawson straightened his tie, a nervous tick. He tried to summon a shred of his old arrogance, to look down his nose at her, but he couldn't find the height. "Louise," he nodded, his voice tight and raspy. "I see you managed to land on your feet." Louise looked at him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vindictive. There was no hate in her eyes, only a calm, detached pity. It was the look one gives to a structure that has been condemned, not with malice, but with the understanding that it simply wasn't built to last. "It wasn't luck, Dawson," Louise said, her voice clear and carrying effortlessly through the lobby. "It was physics. What goes up must come down, and what has a solid foundation," she tapped her heel decisively on the marble floor, "stays standing." Dawson opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an insult or a defense, but found he had nothing left to say. The equation was balanced. The variable had been solved. Louise turned to the hostess, offering a warm smile. "Is this gentleman bothering the guests?" "No, Ms. Banks," the hostess said, closing the reservation book. "He was just leaving." Louise turned back to her team, her back to Dawson. "Come on, everyone. Let's not let the appetizers get cold. I ordered the 1996 Chateau Lafite. I hear it's peaking perfectly right now." As Louise walked into the dining room to thunderous applause from her staff, the heavy oak doors closing behind her, Dawson Brown stood alone in the lobby. He turned up his collar against the cold draft from the street door and walked out into the rain. Just another face in the crowd, while the woman he called dumb toasted to the city she had saved. The story of Louise Banks proves one undeniable, universal truth. Arrogance is a flimsy material, prone to cracking under pressure, but intelligence is reinforced steel. Dawson Brown thought he could judge a person's value by their uniform, mistaking silence for submission and service for stupidity. He forgot that the strongest pillars are often the ones doing the heavy lifting out of sight, buried deep beneath the surface. In a world full of Dawsons, people who value image over substance and profit over people, be a Louise. Never let anyone underestimate your worth based on your current station in life. Your uniform doesn't define you. Your mind does. And remember, when they try to break you, when they try to bury you under the weight of their own ego, that is the moment you show them exactly what you are made of. If you enjoyed seeing karma hit hard and intelligence win the day, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people who need to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story about justice being served. What would you have done if you were in Louise's shoes? Would you have confronted Dawson sooner or waited for the perfect moment? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next video.